Welcome back. Now let's look at the colonization of South America by Europeans. To understand the colonization of South America by Europeans, we really want to focus on the idea that Native Americans, as we now know them, had reached all parts of the continent of South America by about 11,000 BC. This means that it took 12,000 years before Afro-Eurasia once again reached contact or made contact with peoples from South America. We also know that in 1492, Columbus, quote-unquote, discovers the Caribbean and American continents. This began a wave after wave after wave of Europeans into the Americas, and contact and colonization soon followed. But there's an issue with the narrative of Columbus. There's a problem with it, and that's that Columbus wasn't the only person and the only leader sailing amongst the oceans of the world. A man by the name of Cabral, a Portuguese sailor, had become blown off coast when he was sailing southwest, as we discussed in an earlier video, from Portugal to get around Africa and to India. So when he did get blown off course, he made contact, or at least he claimed to witness the continent of South America 270 leagues west of his original destination, his original departure point, Cape Verde. This was a problem, a very logical one. Portugal now felt that they deserved to control and colonize the Americas, as did Spain from their experience with Columbus. So now these two nations, these two brand new Catholic nations, are threatening war against each other. So an agreement had to be reached, and this agreement, signed in 1494, came to be known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas was brokered by the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church. He helped both nations, Spain and Portugal, to agree that a line of 270 leagues west of Cape Verde would be established. Again, 270 leagues, because this is how far the sailor claimed to be off course. West of this line would be Spanish, and east of this line would be Portuguese. Yes, they thought that they could divide up the entire world between the two of them. This is why, though, we have Spain controlling the majority of nations in South America and Central America and the Caribbean after Columbus's expeditions. And this is why we have Portugal settling most of the islands around Africa, parts of Africa, and throughout the area we now know as the Indies. Spain and Portugal began colonization, and their main mission, as part of their main mission, would not just be to gain wealth, but to gain a religious conversion of all those they met from various indigenous religions to Catholicism. By the end of the colonial period, other nations also began to colonize the Americas. In the north, we have the French and the English, and in Mexico and Central America, obviously the Spanish reigned supreme. As well as in Western South America, you have the Spanish as well. And in Eastern South America, what we now know as Brazil, you have the Portuguese. The Dutch colonized a bunch of islands in the Caribbean, as well as Dutch Guiana, later British Guiana and Suriname. And then French Guiana, obviously, was controlled by the French. Russians also got into the action late in the 1800s as they colonized parts of Alaska. So colonial control over the continent was kind of the norm until modern times. So let's talk about colonizers, or why they came. The Spanish came for gold or silver. They came to mine for their wealth. They also came for religious conversion. We need to remember that both sorry about the handwriting there. Both the Spanish and the Portuguese had fought hundreds of years against the Moorish Muslim invaders, and part of their reconquering of their homeland had been a war not just against the Moorish peoples, but of a war of religions. And so the warlike spreading of Catholicism was very important to the Spanish people. The Portuguese came for Brazil wood, coffee, sugar. In essence, they came to grow or farm their goods. They also did bring Catholicism, but it wasn't the major motivation for them. So, what we have is a situation where what we now know as South America was pretty much divided for the colonial era between Spain and Portugal. Ironically, Portugal controlled the eastern portions of South America, and Spain controlled the western portions of South America. Ironically, it's opposite of where they control in the Iberian Peninsula. The economics of the colonial period were actually based largely on the growing of coffee and sugar, mostly for the Portuguese, but the Spanish also were a part of this, and mines to gain gold and silver, and that was mostly for the Spanish. In both of these industries, plantation, which means farming for money, in the same crop, cash crops usually, and mining, both of them required large amounts of workers. So at first, Spain and Portugal enslaved Native Americans and forced them as slaves or as part of their taxation system into working in the plantations and the mines. This failed for two reasons. First, Native Americans knew the land better, and so they often ran away. But more significantly, as you recall, Native Americans were isolated from Afro-Eurasia for about 12,000 years. During this period, many diseases had sprung up in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And these diseases had caused many people in Africa, Asia, and Europe to die. And those who lived were those who had the ability in their body, the antibodies, to fight the disease or to live through the disease. So the Native Americans didn't have the benefit of thousands of years of their ancestors living through disease, which means when the Native Americans first made contact with the Europeans, typical basic diseases to Europeans, things that they get as a child or as a young adult and they live through, would kill Native Americans because their bodies hadn't developed ways of fighting these diseases because they had never seen, their ancestors had never seen these diseases. So Native Americans died in large numbers when they were forced in contact with Europeans. And so in Spanish and Portuguese South America, Native Americans as a workforce just couldn't work, just couldn't make it happen. So they began to import, and I say import on purpose. They began to take as commodities human beings out of Africa, force them into slavery, and force them to work in the mines and plantations of South America. They established a class system based on race, which we're going to talk about in a moment. One thing I'd like to point out is both Portugal and Spain had a multiracial society at home, unlike other parts of Europe, like Great Britain, for instance, where everybody is pretty much of the same ethnic background. Spain, from the Moorish invasions from northern Africa, had a significant population with different ethnic backgrounds, as did Portugal. And so it was common in both Spain and Portugal to view people's race not only for what layer in society or level of society they'd be in, but to realize that slavery was not a permanent condition. So let's take a look at this. The colonial class system. We're going to go through this in detail. Make sure you pay attention because this is a huge part of the stories we'll hear throughout the unit. At the top were the Peninsulares. These were Spaniards born on the peninsula, or Spain. They owned the majority of land. They were given special rights during the colonial period by the Spanish government. They were allowed basically leadership positions in society. They had less laws against them, and they overall had a better life. Beneath the Peninsulares were the group called the Criollos. The Criollos were Spaniards born in the Americas. These were sons and daughters of Peninsulares, and they inherited the Peninsulares' land. So these were, we could think of them as pure Europeans, without any other ethnic blood, you could say, but they were born in the Americas. They were beneath the Peninsulares just for the very fact that they were born in the Americas. Beneath them were the Mestizos. The Mestizos were any people who were Spanish and Native American. They had limited opportunities for land ownership. They were considered in lower positions. Now, Spanish men and Native women often had children early in colonization, early in the period right after Columbus and the conquistadors. This was because, obviously, most of the conquistadors were men. Very few women traveled from Europe. And so interracial marriages were not only seen as okay, but were actually the norm among people who weren't incredibly wealthy and thus able to bring, women or their wives over from Europe. So mestizos were a large portion of the society, especially early on in colonial South America, Spanish South America. Beneath them were the actual Native Americans, full-blooded Native Americans and African slaves. They had little to no land ownership. They were given very few rights, and in many cases they were forced into labor. African slavery, though, was not a permanent condition in Spanish South America, nor in Brazilian South America. In both Spanish and Portuguese colonies, African slaves would live out their days as a slave, but their children were granted independence and freedom. So to be born a slave was not such a thing. You weren't like in the United States, once a slave, always a slave. You could buy yourself out of slavery with extra work that you did after you're working for your master. And you could, of course, have your children buy you because they were free the whole time. So once they were of age to work, they could earn a wage and buy you as well. This meant that slaves in both Spanish South America and Brazilian South America had to be imported into the continent in larger numbers than you could even imagine when comparing to the United States. So slavery was a very real situation in Spanish and Portuguese South America, but it was very, very different in terms of the final condition to the United States. Our next video, we'll talk about the independence of Spanish South America. We'll talk about this in detail. If you have any questions from the video you just watched, make sure you watch again or go back to older videos on the YouTube channel for more detail. Good luck.